To today's webinar entitled 30 Years After the Promulgation of the Employment Equity Act, is the visible minority concept still relevant in measuring inequalities in the labor market? A short description of this webinar. Addressing challenges of racial discrimination starts by accurately measuring the social processes leading to exclusion. The visible minority concept, widely used in Canada to that effect, has recently been the object of increasing criticism. This presentation will present preliminary research results and possible avenues for improvement considered by Statistics Canada. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to go over some housekeeping rules. The webinar will run from approximately 60 to 70 minutes. Please submit your questions to us using either the chat or Q&A feature. At the end of the presentation, we will moderate and ask your questions to our presenter on air. The webinar is being recorded, and this recording will be posted on our website in the coming week. And now, permit me to introduce our today's speaker. Letitia Martin is an analyst at the Centre for Ethnocultural Language and Immigration Statistics at Statistics Canada. She completed a BA and MA in sociology from the Université de Montréal. She has been working in the field of immigration statistics for more than 10 years. Throughout her career at Statistics Canada, she has worked at improving control and imputation processes for immigration data, including the addition of the immigrant admission category to the 2016 census. In addition to immigration, her fields of interest are, among others, data quality, social inequities, and ethnocultural categorization. Now take it away, Letitia.
All right. Okay. Bonjour tout le monde. Hi. Okay. Parce qu'au départ, je veux vous remercier pour l'invitation. Je suis vraiment contente d'être ici avec vous pour pouvoir discuter. I have to admit that it's the first time that I'm working directly with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. I believe there is a direct connection between the research project I'll talk about today and the work of the foundation. So I'm really hoping that we can both beneficiate from this exchange today on both sides and with all the audience. Okay, but before we go too much into the detail, I just want us to discuss a little bit about the context of today's reflection, make sure we're all on the same page. Now, I know the terminology, just even using the word visible minority can be a little bit sensitive sometimes. Some people prefer the word race, racialized groups. They often relate to the same terminology. But just because today I want to focus on the concept that is defined through the Employment Equity Act, I will really stick to this terminology, but it's by no means an indication that I prefer this terminology compared to other ones. So yes, the visible minority is a concept that is deeply anchored within the Canadian legislative framework, and it defines visible minority as person other than Aboriginal people who are non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. And the visible minority are one out of the 4 designated groups under the Act, along with women, Aboriginal people, and persons with disabilities. So the goal of the Employment Equity Act is to ensure that no one is denied employment opportunity and benefit, and in our case, because of their ethnocultural characteristics. So today, just want to make sure we're not evaluating if the law is meeting its objective, but it's rather a reflection on the relevance of the concept to illustrate the socioeconomic gaps we observe in today's society. So, I totally agree. You've probably seen it. The title is catchy. Assessing the relevance of the visible minority concept is a very ambitious project. We won't do that over our 1 hour or so webinar today. I want us to focus more on the categorization for today. This project is a part of a broader project we have at Statistics Canada, and that will involve a lot of other aspects, including testing of new questions, consultation with other federal departments, academic experts, and community leaders. But the project today is more data-driven, and we will focus on how we categorize the groups. So, and sometimes people ask me, why do we categorize people? Why do we want to attribute them a label? And I will agree with you all that at the end, every individual experience is unique. But when we are able to come up with a good categorization, it can help us to illustrate some of the social dynamics, and in our case, it's one of inclusion or exclusion, So this helps us to better address some of the challenges that some groups are facing. Now, by no means today, what I will present to you is final. I'm presenting it for the first time. All I want to do is engage the discussion, get your feedback on the resonance of what we're doing. Is it making sense in your own perspective? So I'm really looking for your feedback, and there will be room for improvement to this project later. Now, how do we assess that, the relevance of the category? So what I've used is the 2016 Census of Population data, focusing on the core working age population, so age 25 to 54, and I'm excluding Aboriginal people. I mean, this choice is just to stay in line with the definition of the Employment Equity Act definition. Since they generally have very different labor market dynamics, I run 4 different models. So looking separately at male and female and Canadian-born and immigrants. Now, the methodology that I've used is what we call cluster analysis that help us grouping some of the groups we have based on the similarity of their economic outcomes. And I'll go a little bit more into detail of what this grouping means with you now. Okay. So first, let's look at the visible minority alone. Basically, on the census, we ask this, we just ask, is this person? And then we provide all the categories that we have. People can check one box, or we encourage them to check more than one box if applicable. So people can either be white, South Asian, Chinese, Black, Filipino, Latin American, Arab, Southeast Asian, West Asian, Korean, Japanese, or if they don't fall or they don't feel they belong to any of these, they can also specify another group. Now, what I've added in gray lighter font at the bottom is the multiple visible minority category. So we don't offer it on the questionnaire, but when people mark more than one, in some cases, we will classify them. When we disseminate, we also have this category. Now, I'm not going to go over all the criticisms that we get, but what we hear often is there is some, at least discrepancies in terms of the category that we have. They measure all different things. We can have skin colors. There is specific ethnic groups. So you're looking at, for example, the Chinese and the Japanese that are very specific. And we have very wide groups when we look at white or black, for example. So that's a little bit of the criticisms that we hear. And now for today, because we want to understand better some of these groups and assess the categorization, I have disaggregated them with ethnic origin. So the ethnic origin, basically it's an open-ended question where we ask where the ethnic or cultural origin of this person ancestor. People are provided 4 lines to write as many as origin as they would like, and we keep at the end, we retain 6 of them for dissemination purposes. So, and we disseminated over 250 categories in 2016. Now, this is a lot of categories, and one of the today's limitation analysis, it's a starting point. So I've kept only single response. We know there is multiple response, but it adds a layer of complexity. So for today, we will limit only on single response, but don't worry, I will add this later on to my analysis, and I'm not going to leave the multiple response on the side. Okay, now the challenge when we do statistics, and I'm sure some of you face it often when we work with smaller population, is to have robust analysis, we have to create some group. So what I did is, before even going at the analysis that I'm talking about today, I did some primary grouping, and I used the clustering analysis to come up with that. So I've put there some of the groupings that I've made, and all the rest were kept. So they were kept alone also on their own. So I created a grouping with what I call other North American origin, and we kept the American and Canadian on their own because they were showing different patterns. For the European origin, we grouped them with the British Isles, the French, and then Western, Northern, Eastern, and Southern European origins. They were all grouped together. In the Caribbean, I grouped the origin coming from the sovereign states of the Lesser Antilles. Lots of grouping in the African origin as well. So I have one group for the Central and West African origin. The Algerian and Egyptian were shown to have different patterns, so keep them in a single group together in their own, but created another group for the other North African origin. I have one group for the Somali and the Sudanese that were specific as well, one for Zimbabwean, and then we create a grouping for the other Southern and East African origins. Now, in West Central Asia and the Middle Eastern origin, I kept Lebanese and Turk on their own, and we have other Middle Eastern origin, one category for Afghan and Azaran, and one other for other Central Asian origin. So just to go more into the grouping now. So this is just giving you an idea of the number of disaggregation that I have when I'm limiting my sample size. So I had a threshold, I needed a minimum of 300 cases to be included in my analysis, and I've looked only at single ethnic origin. So what you'll see is when I run my analysis for, let's say, male Canadian born, I have 36 groups. For the immigrant male, 65 and 3572 for the female population. The number of categories. So you see that some visible minority have more categories. So it just means that there is more diversity in terms of ethnic origin for the white population, the South Asian, the Black, and the Latin American groups. So they are the groups that people often stated that they are very broad. So in our analysis, we'll take all those like 30, 70 each points, and we will cluster them based on their similarity. So for example, we can have more than one point representing the Canadian ethnic origin. We have three. In fact, we have one for the South Asian, for the Black, and for the white. So it really used those two responses in conjunction, and they create single entries. Now, if we want an effective categorization to support the idea behind the Employment Equity Act, I mean, we expect to see points that represent the white population to be clustered together and cluster in grouping showing the highest economic outcome, because we think that the visible minority are disadvantaged on the labor market. So we expect all those visible minority to be clustered in grouping with lower outcomes. And in looking more specifically into the groupings outside of the visible minority, not a visible minority categorization, we will also expect the different category for each visible minority groups to be clustered together. So if it's not the case, that would mean that we tend to homogenize the experience of certain groups, and it perhaps could prevent us to clearly identify where the needs are the greatest. Now, given our time constraint today for the webinar, I won't have time to go over the results for all the models. But given, I mean, you can see it, and it's clearly with the number of groupings that we have for the immigrants. It's because of Canada's recent immigrant trends. The immigrant population is more diversified in terms of ethnic origin than the Canadian-born population. So this is why today we will mainly focus on immigrants and specifically in immigrant male. But for the main findings that we will draw from the analysis we have, I can assure you that what I'm saying is also replicated with the 4 other models, although we can find some of the most specific pattern and the magnitude of some of them, they can slightly differ. Okay, and what are these economic outcomes that we will be clustering them by? We will have indicator on the access to the labor market, so talking about employment rate, and some indicator about the quality of the job, looking at full-time employment rate and income. Now, first, before running the analysis, we wanted to neutralize the effect of the group composition. For example, we know that some of these groups are younger than others or more educated than others, so all of that can have an impact on their economic outcome. So we have standardized them by economic region of residence, age and highest level of schooling, so looking at if the person had a university degree at the bachelor level or above or not. And for the immigrant population, we also took into account the knowledge of English and or French, their year of immigration, and their immigrant admission category. So this is the standardized economic outcomes that we are clustering and that we see on the next slide. Okay, now I don't want to scare anybody. There's lots of results in there. There is a lot of understanding we can make or sense we can make out of them. I've looked at these graphs for hours and I still find new things. But don't worry, we'll go through that slowly. And you see for the next slide, it will always be the same graph, but I will bring you to see some of the more specific trends that I think are relevant to our research question today. But just so we understand each other, all the points that you see there, they all correspond to a disaggregated visible minority group, the one we talked about earlier. So the 65 groups are on this graph. And just to ease the understanding or the view of it for us, I color-coded them by their visible minority groups. So you see the legend at the right of your graph. Now, and this is the challenge a little bit when you do a graph like this, I was able to graph it only with 2 of the indicators, not the 3 of them, but I'll show you later what were the grouping or the cluster made, and the clusters takes into account all the indicators that I have. And if you have some suggestions for more indicators, I'd be more than happy to add some of them to make it even more robust. Now, just took a step back a little bit and look at this graph. I know there is lots and lots of information, but just generally speaking, if you look at the broad picture, you can see like at the top right of your graph, there is light blue dots. And those light blue dots corresponds to the white population. And you can see the more colored dots or points that are a little bit below. So I guess it confirms this general idea that led to the enactment of the Employment Equity Act in the 1980s, saying that there seems to be some advantage in terms of economic outcome for the white population. However, behind this broad picture, I mean, what we can also see is a lot of dispersion of the points representing the visible minority groups. What does it mean? It means that this wide range of economic outcomes, it's, at least on my perspective, when I look at that, I'm seeing that if we aggregate them all together and we start talking about visible minority, I believe we're probably missing some of the, some part of what is happening or the dynamic that is happening. And we probably not focusing all the time on the most vulnerable groups. And this reinforced the criticisms that was expressed by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And these comments come from you guys on the field that when we use the aggregated visible minority groups, we tend to homogenize the experience of the different minority groups, and we divert the attention from where the needs are really the greatest. Now, I'm going to skip the next slide because I really want to be able to fit in on the time and give you a chance for the question period. So what we have now, it's the same graph again, you know, so we don't need to look at it. It's exactly the same point. What I did is I just added the clustering. So the blue line that you have there, it's how the SAS program clustered them together. And I really want to draw your attention to some specific things that I believe are interesting to look at. So if you look at the ethnic origins that are associated with the 3 visible minority groups, the Filipino, the Latin American, and the Japanese, we're finding them in the cluster 6, 4, and 1. So they are all found in clusters that are shown with the white population. So this brings us to this trivial question that led the Employment Equity Act is if we include those people in our target population for the Employment Equity Program, aren't we diverting our attention from where the needs are the greatest again? So, I mean, I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves. Should we be considering them as subject to discrimination? Maybe yes, maybe no. We'll have to put more thought into it. Okay. Now, looking at the South Asian and the Black, we see inversely that these are among the most heterogeneous population we have among the visible minority groups. They are heterogeneous in terms of ethnocultural and immigration characteristics, but also heterogeneous in terms of their relative economic outcomes. So for the South Asian, we have some ethnic groups that are more on the average high outcome side, but we also have some of the groups that are found in the most vulnerable groups, such as the Bengalis, the Bangladeshis, and the Pakistanis. Even more heterogeneous for the Black population, they are dispersed in three different at least big groupings that I made, with the Somalis and the Sudanese and the other North African origin that are the most vulnerable ones. Okay, so now another interesting result that I found is we always question about, what is the relation between the responses to the ethnic origin and what is the responses to the visible minority groups. So we often hear, how do we define people from Middle Eastern origin who are white, who is Arab? So I've looked at it, and this is what you see mostly in cluster 2. So looking at Middle Eastern origin, we have them in 4 different visible minority groups. So people from Middle Eastern origin, they will either say that they are white, West Asian, or they will say that they are Arab. So no matter what they say on the visible minority question, they all get clustered together, which tells me that their ethnic origin is a more determining factor in their economic outcome than their self-identified response to the visible minority groups, and we see the same thing for the Lebanese. And I've also added the Turk there, which is one of the other white dots that are on the lower outcome side, and we classify them usually in the West Asian categories at Statistics Canada. So although they identify as being white, we see that their economic outcomes is closer to the other Middle Eastern origin. Now, the opposite is true for the North African origin. So interestingly enough, if people reported North African origin, either they declare themselves as being Black, Arab, or white, it makes a difference in their economic outcome. So those who declare themselves as being white are clustered with the other white groups. Those who consider themselves as Arab are clustered with the other Arab categories, and the Blacks are in the cluster with another group, so they are the most vulnerable Black population that we have. And we see something similar for the Algerian. So for these particular groups, the self-response to the visible minority, self-identification to the visible minority groups seems to be more relevant in understanding what are the economic situation on the labor market. Now, we've looked only at immigrants before. Now I'm just going to show you some of the non-immigrant male, the Canadian-born male, just because we find a new category there that isn't shown for the immigrant population, which are the ethnic Canadian response. So just as we've observed for the North African origin, the Canadian response is also better. The visible minority response is a better indicator of their economic outcomes. So either they declare themselves as Black, South Asian, or white. Okay, and also, as I've said, we don't have really lots of times to go into all these details together for these specific groups, the Canadian-born one, but maybe we can point out some of the things that were a bit different from the immigrants. So, I mean, when we look at the Canadian-born male population, the Canadian origin, so once again, we see the white, and there's a bit more of clustering, the white being on the highest outcomes compared to the visible minority one. But the specific we've discussed about, so the fact that the Black and the South Asians are in different clusters still holds for this population. The only thing that is maybe a little bit different is for the Latin American now, they seems to not cluster so well with the white population compared to what we saw for the immigrant population. Okay, so I guess if we just try to wrap up a little bit and come back to our initial question and what those graphs are telling us. So remember, we were asking, is the visible minority concept relevant in measuring inequalities? Specifically, is the classification or the category that we're using informing us on the different dynamics that occur on the labor market as it is today. So the general idea behind the Employment Equity Act is supported by the analysis we did. There appear to be some economic advantage for the white population, and this regardless of their ethnic origin, and once again with some exception for the West Asian who declare themselves as white. Now, the overall categorization of the visible minority is also generally making sense. The disaggregated groups, again, we see that they tend to cluster within their own groups. You know, the color were showing similar patterns, and we can see some kind of clustering, although that wasn't just like clear spots for all of them. So that's why we could benefit for further refinement of some categories, and this will allow us to deepen our understanding of the inclusion or exclusion dynamics, and it will help us addressing, I believe, some of the socioeconomic gaps of different ethnic groups a little bit more accurately. So just quickly summarizing what we have, I think the main findings, and I'm a little bit shy today in front of you guys to talk about a finding because I think we've heard you a lot in the field, and you were the first one to debate about it and bring it back to you. But I think we have to repeat it. I think it's important for us, public servants, to be reminded of that. And it's important also we heard a lot from journalists is, you know, this category of visible minority as an aggregated entity is not making that much sense. They are very too heterogeneous. And I really like, and I'm going to cite this some of the Justice Rosalie Silberman Abela, what she said when she defined the visible minority groups. I think the concept, she warned us to say that if we were to combine all non-whites together as visible minorities for the purpose of devising systems to improve their equitable participation, without making distinctions to assist those groups in particular needs, this may deflect attention from where the problems are the greatest. So I think this is one of the biggest conclusions we can take today is we want to talk about specific groups and maybe not so much about the aggregated one. Now, we also seen that Filipinos, Japanese, and to a lesser extent the Latin American, they tend to show economic outcomes similar to the one observed for the white population. We also see that the Black population and the South Asian will have some heterogeneity in terms of economic groups depending on their ethnic origin, and we could probably benefit on refining furthermore those categories to understand exactly what is the inclusion or exclusion dynamic. Same thing, so when we look at using either ethnic origin or visible minority to try to study some economic outcomes, we find that for Middle East and West Asia, we can more accurately capture the situation using their ethnic origin, while when we're looking from people origin of North Africa and ethnic Canadian, we can more accurately capture them by their self-identification to the visible minority question rather than their ethnic origin. now, the next step, and I'll be honest with you all, I mean, my colleagues here this week, they were asking me to propose a new categorization, and they were pushing, and they wanted me to come with that today. And I thought of it, and I still feel that there's more I need to do before I can propose something clear. I wasn't comfortable to come. That will come in the next coming months, but I really feel I have to deepen my understanding of what is happening, especially right now. I really want to look at the multiple response, because we know the population in Canada is getting more and more diversified. So I want to look at what is the impact of those multiple response, but also want to look at the effect of some other ethnocultural variable. For example, looking at the country of ancestry of people and religion, see if they can be a better predictor, or at least help me create this grouping. Now, I haven't shown you, but I'm going to put it there. And I've used the woman just because, the immigrant woman there, just because I haven't shown you that. But for those of you who have looked at it, the results were the same for the immigrant male. Is what I realized is on those low outcome groups, so talking about the Afghan, the North African origin, people from Middle Eastern, West Asian, the Pakistani, the Somali, the Sudanese, the Bangladeshi, and the Bengali. I mean, these populations that are the most vulnerable are mostly all are in big proportion Muslim. So I think this is really our next step. We have to understand the effect of religion if we want to create groupings that are really appropriate. So that will be it for me. I'm really curious to hear your feedback, to know if those results make sense in terms of your own perspective, from your own understanding. Most of you guys are on the field all the time, so I'm really curious to know what you think about it. So thank you.
Hi, Letitia. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for all your hard work in putting that together. We're going to dive into questions. Just a reminder, if you want to submit a question, please use your chat or Q&A feature. So the first question I'm going to ask you, and let me know if you can hear me okay. Have you considered Okay, wonderful. Have you considered the fact that there could be a relation between the self-identification to the visible minority group and their economic situation? So, for example, in some regions of the world, people could be considered as white if they're wealthy, regardless of their skin tone. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, and I think maybe we can, I don't know if I can go back to some of the slides that I have. We've heard that mostly for the Latin Americans. So people are often saying that okay, now can we see, are you guys seeing the slide okay, or? No, I guess do you see the same thing as I see? There's not the whole slide there.
Yep, we can see the slide. Okay, it's good. Thank you.
Okay, so it's only me. Okay, so just looking at this. Okay, so I think this is this one. Okay, I don't see on my side because of the thumbnails, I don't see it. But so we hear that a lot for the Latin American groups. But on this slide, what you can see clearly is at least this idea is not so much supported by the data that we have. So there's a little bit of difference. So people who are of Mexican ethnic origin, for example, some are declaring themselves as being white, and some are declaring themselves as being Latin American. But at the end, when we look at their relative economic outcome, there's not much difference to that. So the only exception to that is, again, when we look at, and this is the same thing for the Middle Eastern and the West Asian. So at least that would be my answer to that question. Yep.
Okay, that's great. So we just got another question in, so I'm just going to forward that over to you, and it kind of, I think, builds a little bit on that. So they ask, when we aggregate, we also homogenize the outcomes of white ethnic minorities. Take the case of Portuguese as an example. Have you looked at the Portuguese, a white European group, which show labor market outcomes in the second generation that are similar to many visible minority groups?
So as I said earlier, when I looked at aggregating, so I did the first pass of it with the first cluster analysis, and there was nothing standing really coming out of that. Now, all of that being said, I really need to create those groups with a minimal number of responses. So when I don't have enough, I'm not able to cluster them together, to make a cluster of their own. But yes, I've heard about the Portuguese and the Greek. I will have to look at it more deeply. But in terms of white, when I was looking at it for the first pass, at least, of the cluster analysis, they were showing results that were really similar to the other white categories. And this is not to say that they don't have different outcomes, but relatively speaking, I wasn't able, once I was controlling for all the factors I talked about, there was no much difference. So, I mean, but there could be difference in terms of their age group too, and on terms of their economic outcomes. And if you guys have some other variable you think I should be taking into account, I would be more than happy to look at it. Or if you have research project that shows those differences, maybe I can understand better. But I couldn't find any of those differences in my data at this point.
Okay, fantastic. So another question that just came in was somebody saying, bit surprised by some of the outcomes. When I look at the younger cohort, the 25 to 34 first and second gen, Chinese origin outcomes seem the strongest. Black, Latin American, and to a lesser extent, Arab and Western Asian seem weaker. This may reflect the cohort chosen, and it's a generally similar pattern when controller for a field of study at the university level. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm sorry, can you just repeat it, but a bit slower? I think I missed part of that question.
Sorry about that. And I hope that I keep the integrity of the question as well. The person writes, a bit surprised by some of the outcomes. When they look at the younger cohort, the 25 to 34, first and second generation, Chinese origin outcomes seem the strongest, and Black, Latin American, and to a lesser extent, Arab and Western Asian seem weaker. Maybe this reflects the cohort chosen, and it's a generally similar pattern for the field of study at a university level. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes. I guess it's a little bit harder for me to talk about the second generation because the sample size were not big enough for me to take those, to draw any conclusion on them, especially when I'm start crossing with ethnic origin. So I had to lump them with the non-immigrant population. And yes, I don't know. There's really a lot of limitation. I wish I could look into that, and maybe I have to find a little bit more of this looking at this specific population. Maybe when I come with bigger grouping, but for now, I'm afraid I don't have much of an answer for those second generation. Sorry about that. And especially by age group now, if I'm starting to disaggregate it for the younger cohort, it's the group size are becoming too small for me to be able to compare each other together and come up with something that is robust. Thank you. No. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem.
And thank you for your answers. They're really, really well thought out and really match well with the presentation. So just a question we got in. Is in any way related to this as a barrier for employment integration that called Canada experience affecting many first generation of newcomers? Has this been measured?
Okay. So yes, this is one of comments. I was presenting this to my team this weekend. This is one of the comments I've heard about. So this Canadian experience and the Canadian education that I didn't take into account. I will use it to refine my model at a later date, and I will share the results later. But yes, that's definitely a criticism that I got from what I did, and I want to try to include that. And also one other dimension that I want to have that I've heard about is when you see especially the Filipinos that are ranked really high in terms of high outcomes and the score high in the economic outcomes. I had people telling me that most of these people will work 75 hours a week, really outside of like combine 2 or 3 jobs together to be able to make ends meet. So are we considering that as a good inclusion process? I'm not sure. So I will also have to factor that in the number of hours. So that's all the type of things I want to add to refine my model at a later date.
Okay, thank you very much. So another question is, have you considered factoring in some immigration characteristics while defining your groups? So, for example, now that refugees are usually a more vulnerable population, shouldn't you take this into consideration in your analysis?
Yes, I think, it's well known that the refugee are a more vulnerable population for sure. Now, the challenge I have here, I was controlling for it. At first, when I did my modeling, we could see, I wasn't controlling for the immigration category, and I could see pockets are really clustering based on these, so I started controlling it to take this factor away. Now, the challenge that I have is, and this is true, all these people are not starting with the same advantages. They come with trauma, and this makes a difference on how they can adapt or adjust to life in Canada. And we know that these are long-lasting consequences. But on the other side, when we look at the Employment Equity Act, we are really interested in the effect of ethnocultural characteristics. So all of that to be said is, even if with the Employment Equity Act, we really focus on the ethnocultural characteristics, there's a lot of other characteristics that can put people vulnerable. And we still encourage to have programs to help those refugees. But also in the terms of the Employment Equity Act, I think we really want to get something more based on the ethnocultural factor that could impact the inclusion or the exclusion dynamics.
Okay, thank you. And so you kind of touched on this in your last question, but we've gotten a lot of comments on how interesting this research is, and it's very thought-provoking. So what would the impact of this research be on the Employment Equity Act?
So, Statistics Canada, we're not the one defining the law. This is more in the hands of our political representative. I'm hoping, and as I've said, we're working on a much broader project as Statistics Canada, and we really hope that this can be used at least to think about, to rethink or see if the Employment Equity Act is still effective or if there should be some modification. So we are in discussion, and we really want to go, and as I said earlier, we want to make consultation with the community groups as well, with academics as well. I think we have to put a little bit more thought into it to make sense of it, but we want to share the results with other federal key departments, and hopefully this will make all its way up, and we can maybe come up with something that will better address the discrepancies that we have right now. But on our side, our main focus now is, at least if the law stays the same, we also produce some knowledge at Statistics Canada in understanding those conditions. So we're hoping for hopefully, at least that's our target date now for the next census, is that we'd be able to disseminate different groupings other than what is on the visible minority, so we can still inform the population on those dynamics and get this knowledge out there. That's the scope of what we can do at this point more concretely.
That's great. So kind of along the lines of employment still, have the experiences of temporary workers been taken into account in this data?
No, unfortunately, I have to exclude them from the analysis. They are very, very specific groups. Their sample size is very small. We know we tend to have an important other coverage of this population on the census too. Yes, so there's not enough data, and the dynamics is different too. So all those temporary foreign workers, they come with a job, so they have to have a job most of the time, like how before they come. So this type of analysis, it's hard to replicate for this population, unfortunately.
Okay, and also talking about impacts on data, do you take into account language at all, specifically the people's knowledge of the official languages?
So yes, for the immigrant population, we control for the knowledge of official language because we know it's an important determining factor of labor market integration. Of course, for the Canadian population, I wasn't able to control for it because there's so few people who doesn't know one or the two official language. But yes, I control for that effects when we standardize for the our economic outcome.
That's great. So, the work that you've done is really interesting starting point for discussions, but community groups working have a more direct contact with the reality in the field. So shouldn't you consider their point of view as well?
Absolutely. I think that's really the discussion we want to engage now. And as I said, it's the analysis that I'm presenting right now is really part of a broader project we have at Statistics Canada. And we're still working now on the base of the consultation we want to do. So try to come up with a list of organizations we want to consult with and what feedback exactly we're looking for. But that will be a very important element of the work we're doing, because on the field, they are the first respondent. Like, people are working directly in the communities. They know and they can give us a good knowledge. Often they are the first one to see also the new trends emerging that we can take a little bit longer to see in the data because we need many years or bigger sample. So yes, their opinion would be very important in our larger project, and we're looking forward to hear from community workers and community leaders as well.
Okay, well, that's great. And we've answered a lot of questions today, so I think we're going to wrap up. And I just want to thank everyone so much for your questions today. They were wonderful. And thank you so much to our presenter, Letitia. I just want to thank you so much. And I just want to end today by saying that the Canadian Race Relations Foundation hosts regular webinars on topics related to race, racism, and race relations and diversity in Canada. And we're always looking for new topics and ideas, so please feel free to reach out to us directly with any suggestions. Thank you again to your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thank you.